Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 26. It's not the end, not the last day. The next morning, Lieutenant Thorne left the mansion for the first time in nearly a week and walked the cold, quiet roads of Edge. The professor gave him the day off to return to the fort, and he suspected that Slither needed some time away from him as much as the young officer wanted to escape. He was a little surprised by the condition of the roads. He expected them to be empty, but there were several people moving their belongings into the now abandoned houses. He paid little attention to them as he strode to the burial pit at the old riverbank. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to see, but he was a little surprised that the area was already completely filled in and piled over with rock. There wasn't a shred of evidence that so many people had lost their lives there only the day before. There wasn't even a marker of any kind, nor would there be. The lieutenant stared at the pile, feeling unsatisfied. Mari woke that morning with the realization that no one in the world would be holding a funeral. No one would remember the newly dead, well, except to steal their goods and houses, and no one would care that her friends from years ago were now gone. She dressed and walked outside to the orchard. She wanted to honor them somehow, because she was an old woman who had escaped their forced death. Her ponderings were interrupted, however, by noticing that the slush on the ground was frozen, not melting as early snows usually did. It was a bad sign, and she gulped in worry. To the end of the orchard she trudged, and looked up to the sky that hadn't been blue for many, many weeks. "Dear Creator," she said out loud, "tell them all that I remember, that I won't forget them, that I mourn them, that I miss them." That was all she could choke out as the tears bubbled up in her eyes. It wasn't much of a funeral, she knew, but it was all she could manage for thousands of people with only 5 minutes of planning. And because she was suddenly overwhelmed with worldliness. "Why did you let me come here?" she whispered to the cosmos. "I'm such a selfish woman, undeserving of all you've given me. You know what I'm feeling? Jealousy. Of all the un-Salem-like behaviors. Jealous of Tyria, who should be with Milo by now, and Mr. Hegek, who should be surrounded by his wife and family today. And jealous because they may have spent a moment with my husband." Her chin bobbled dangerously. "Who I now realize is not coming back." "Not soon, anyway," she admitted glumly a minute later, and leaned against the cattle fence. "Oh, how stupid I was," she told the leafless tree. "How cruelly optimistic. Deceit's awakened," she mimicked herself. "Perrin will be back in my arms in no time. Oh, how stupid I was. And I was happy," she confessed to a walnut tree. "When everyone else was frightened and worried, I was more chipper than a chipmunk. How utterly obtuse of me." She stared at a gray leaf rolling gently on a layer of frozen snow, pushed along by a frigid breeze. "It's not the end, not the last day," she admitted out loud. It was the first time she'd done that, acknowledged what a cynical part of her brain already knew. "Not going to be for quite a while. We have food for 4 years. Thorne and the world didn't want it, so we can use it until it's all gone. By then we could grow more, and then it could be yet another 4 years, or 10 years, or more, and I'll eventually die a quiet, boring death when I'm 100, but still be waiting, still hoping for the last day. For Perrin. And I'll look back on these days, 25 years previous, and consider how foolish I was to think anything glorious was going to happen at any moment." The snow startled her, coming down in enormous fluffy flakes. It never snowed so heavily so early in the year. Snowing season was a full 6 weeks early. She looked up at the sky, light gray, predictably, and caught a few flakes on her face. Sighing in despair, she murmured, "It's going to take a very, very long time still, isn't it?" She trudged back to the house, her demeanor as bleak as the world around her. Chilled nearly to his bone, the lieutenant left the quiet pit, where nothing stirred and about which no one cared, and headed back to the fort, where he was sure to discover that there was now plenty of food to feed those who remained alive in Edge, since its population was only half. As he marched through the gates, he felt as if he'd been away for an entire season. Piles of snow pushed to the edges of the tall timber walls showed no signs of melting, as such early snowfalls usually did. The compound seemed quieter than normal, maybe because of the bitter cold. He walked up the stairs to the command tower and nodded a greeting to the captain at the front desk. At the command office door, he knocked lightly. "Come in." The lieutenant opened the door and saluted Sergeant Major Healy, who sat behind the big desk. Healy nodded back. "Lieutenant, good to see you again. I imagine you're glad to get out of the mansion, but then again, maybe not?" "No, sir, I am glad. Professor Slither's company is... well, I probably shouldn't say anything more." Healy smiled. "Well said, or rather unsaid. Time to go over the inventory in the storehouses again, as you might expect. Sit down." He gestured to a chair across from the desk. "I'm just compiling the list of dead to compare to the list of living. We need to ration the food down to the last remaining person, just to make sure we don't lose anything." "Sir," the lieutenant said as he sat down, "are we retaining anything for planting next year?" Healy nodded. "We're setting aside a reserve to store in a secret location. At first I was thinking the dungeon might be the best place, but it tends to stink. So I think we'll instead move it to the general cellar. It's already under guard." "Good idea, sir." He paused. "The dungeon, exactly where is it?" Healy pointed straight down. "Below the command tower, about 15 feet underground." "How often is it used?" Healy squinted. "Why do you want to know?" The lieutenant shrugged. "Just curious." "Used too often, in my opinion," Healy sighed. "Only special cases go there. Otherwise, they're sent to the holding cells of the old enforcement building." "Is that any better?" Healy smiled partway. "I know a little of the enforcement building. Trust me, it's a lot better than the dungeon. At least you glimpse the sun every now and then." He straightened the pages in front of him. "I'm going to put you in charge of this. Major Twig and I want a new map of Edge drafted with the names of each person living in each house recorded. The fort will deliver the rations twice a week to each house, bringing only enough to feed those living there. So as you can see, we need an accurate count. I was thinking that with your face and your name, you might be able to..." The lieutenant nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir. I'll be more than happy to walk around and stretch my legs again." More soberly, he added, "And I will do my best to project the correct image of the fort." Healy folded his hands and leaned forward, his dark brown eyes searching. "And what image might that be, Lieutenant?" "Shouldn't Edge believe the fort is here to help them? That the count is occurring to make sure they receive the maximum amount of rations? Now more than ever, they need to see the fort as its rescuer." Healy nodded once. "And how are you going to do that?" The lieutenant smiled fully. "Just by being Lieutenant Lex Shinthorn, sir." Healy rolled his eyes before giving him a genuine smile. "All right, Lieutenant. Do your best to charm the village. Just don't find yourself a girlfriend in every neighborhood." "Don't worry, sir. The general won't allow that kind of behavior at this time, nor do I have any interest right now." Healy sat back. Probably best, considering. He reached over and picked up some pages. "This one's the list of known survivors. Make a copy so I can keep the original here. And this..." He held up additional pages. "Is a list of those who died. I'll have the captain make a copy of this to send to Idemia this afternoon." He studied the list for a moment. "Sir," the lieutenant said, "something wrong?" Healy shrugged. "Not sure what to do about something. There's one name here. Well, I'm not sure how he'll respond to it." The lieutenant stood up and leaned to see. "Where?" Healy pointed. "Priscilla Thorne." "Oh," the lieutenant whispered. "Not that I ever knew him to care about his daughters. Never mentioned them that I remember. Still, knowing your own flesh and blood decided there's nothing left worth living for?" He shook his head. "Twig told me they tried to talk her out of it when she gave her name. One of the rectors even told her this wasn't meant for her. But apparently she said she had nothing left in the world and could never find her mother again. No one knows what happened to Drusus or her other 2 daughters. Probably buried by deceit." Healy sighed. "Do I draw the general's attention to the fact that one of his daughters has died?" The lieutenant thought for a moment. "I think you should. He should know. How he responds to that news isn't your responsibility, it's his. And right now, he's far away, too." Healy scoffed lightly. "You've learned that principle, I see. The nature and detail of news delivered is dictated by the distance away the receiver is when he hears it. At this rate, you should graduate from command school by planting season, Lieutenant." "That's the plan, sir. Not much else to do." "Well, this will keep you occupied for a week. Enjoy a break from Slither. Take a few soldiers with you as you do your count." "Sir, I have an idea about that. How would you and Major Twig feel about the soldiers and I going out unarmed?" "Unarmed?" The lieutenant nodded. "Just to demonstrate we're there as a service, not as a threat. Maybe we could unbutton the top few buttons of our jackets, too, just to look less intimidating." Oddly, Healy's face drained of all color. "Where did you get such an idea?" The lieutenant shrugged. "Just came to me. We can show the citizens we trust them so they can trust us, sir." "Just came to you, naturally." Healy's eyes darted around the lieutenant, as if expecting to see someone standing next to him. "Just don't tell General Thorne," he whispered again. "Since he's far away, I can't imagine it'd be a problem." The lieutenant grinned. "Thank you, sir. I promise this will work." He took the list of survivors' names and bounded out of the office. Healy sat back in his chair and shook his head. "I was only a boy back then, but I well remember the soldiers going door to door without swords and with their top buttons unbuttoned. Worked once before, Major Shin. It should work again." When the lieutenant headed out after midday meal, he was stunned by the falling snow. Not just small wet flakes that forgot they were to be rain, but massive ones, like they saw only in the middle of snowing season. "Wow, those are pretty," exclaimed one of the privates he'd tasked to help him that afternoon. He'd chosen 3 of the most baby-faced soldiers he could find, and now he felt like they were acting no older than toddlers. The other 2 soldiers were sticking out their tongues to catch the snow. "This isn't good," the lieutenant told them. "Why?" one of them asked. "I don't think we'll be cold just because we unbuttoned our top buttons." "I'm not worried about the cold," the lieutenant told them irritably, "but about the earliness of the snow. Oh, never mind. Probably just a fluke. We've got a duty to do, men." With their weapons at the fort and their friendliest smiles in place, they knocked on the first door. It was by the 3rd door that the lieutenant discovered that "Good afternoon, we're from the fort and we're here to help" was the scariest sentence he could utter. They were met with huge eyes and nervous glances until the lieutenant yelled kindly through the door, which slammed in his face, that he was there only to make sure they could deliver the most food possible. That usually resulted in the door reopening. By the end of the first road, the lieutenant knew what to say. "Good afternoon. I'm here to make sure you get the most rations possible. May we ask a few questions about who's living here?" The next day his work was far easier. Not only because the snow ended, after dropping an astounding 10 inches, but because word had spread about his task. Doors swung open eagerly to give the lieutenant the name of each occupant of the house. But by that afternoon he began to see a trend. Some houses had residents with similar names, and a tally made revealed that some people apparently lived in multiple homes. They had to go back to a few in the evening to insist that each member of the family come to the door to be properly counted. No ill uncles in the back room or sick daughters in bed would receive rations. They uncovered 30 cases of residents living in multiple houses. But by the end of the week, the lieutenant and his assistants had the entire village counted, and he was almost sure the count was accurate. During those days, he noticed something. A little kindness went a long way. At each door, the lieutenant flashed his grin, and the residents warmed up to his affable nature. Even those he had to revisit for a more accurate count seemed sorry for deceiving the handsome young officer. As he strolled through Edge, people made a point of waving to him, and a few young women did their best to flirt. He allowed them to think they were successful, just to give them hope. While he could feel the heaviness that lingered in Edge, it seemed to lighten when people saw the smiling officer. The reputation of the little lieutenant was finally turning around. He knew he needed to continue the feelings of goodwill, so when the first dispersals of the new rations were delivered by the soldiers on the 70th of the next week, the lieutenant went along. He stopped at several houses to explain how he sincerely hoped it would be enough. The effect was amazing. Just a few pleasant words, a warm smile, and half a minute at someone's door convinced them that he really cared. Lieutenant Thorne, whose label still read Shin, was there for them. If they had any concerns, he was their man. A few weeks later, by the end of harvest season, he was the most popular person in Edge. Everyone made a point of mentioning that to Major Twig when they saw him. Twig was relieved to see the lieutenant was doing something useful with his face and name for the fort, and he made sure General Thorne heard about it too. And in Idemia, at the beginning of raining season 3 weeks after the first rations were delivered by Lieutenant Lek Thorne, General Thorne read about the efforts of his son. Everyone in Edge seemed most pleased to feel his son's concern. The general sat back in his large chair and smiled. He may have had a few rough patches, but Lek was proving to be quite skilled in diplomacy. Slither was also complimentary, and Lek had sent a message hoping that all was well with him and the guide, and he even signed it, "Your son." He was, Lemuel had to admit, behaving quite admirably. So, what the slag was the little manipulator up to now? Thorne smiled at the worthy challenge growing in Edge before putting down the messages. As he did, he noticed the pages below it, the list of dead from Edge. He'd left it out to make sure that a few key names were there. He scanned the list that had sat on his desk untouched for the past few weeks, and nodded in approval that a few old annoyances were now under a pile of dirt and rock. But a notation next to one name caught his eye. Priscilla Thorne. "Huh," the general said. "Well, at least she wouldn't be interrupting his dinner again." He put the page on the top of a stack needing to be filed, and picked up the next packet of messages from Flax to see if anything interesting was happening there. Predictably, they were telling him about the unusual depths of snow. "As if I can do anything about that," he grumbled, and glanced out the window at the white surrounding the garrison. And the snows fell, and fell, for weeks, for moons, as if it didn't know how to stop, which maybe it didn't. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you. as I read this from Florida, where there is no snow.